She came west in a Paris gown, and he thought she wouldn't last a week. He was a broke cowboy drowning in a rigged debt, one signature away from losing everything his father ever built. She was a woman running from a golden cage in Boston, carrying a briefcase full of secrets no one knew existed. Two strangers, one desperate contract, and a villain who underestimated them both. But what happens when the man who swore to protect her starts bleeding for her instead, and the woman who came to survive begins to fight, not for the land, but for him? Lesson of this story: the greatest partnerships aren't built on convenience. They're built when two broken people choose each other in the fire. Welcome to a channel where the frontier never sleeps. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button, subscribe, and ride with us.
The hem of Victoria Sterling's emerald taffeta skirt, woven in Paris, and entirely unsuited for the brutal winds of the Wyoming Territory, dragged through a viscous puddle of rust-colored mud and what she desperately hoped wasn't horse blood. She didn't gasp. She didn't lift the ruined silk to spare it further indignity. She simply gripped the brass handle of her heavy leather briefcase tighter and stared straight ahead through the settling dust of the Red Creek train station. The town was less a settlement and more a collection of weathered wooden buildings clinging stubbornly to the dirt. The stench of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and stale whiskey hung thick in the afternoon heat. It was a far cry from the polished marble halls and glittering ballrooms of Boston society, but Boston was exactly what she was running from. Heavy boot steps echoed on the wooden boardwalk behind her, a slow, deliberate cadence accompanied by the faint, metallic clink of spurs. Victoria turned. The man standing 4 feet away was tall and broad-shouldered, casting a long shadow in the midday sun. A battered Stetson was pulled low, hiding his eyes, but she could see the sharp, unforgiving line of his jaw and the days-old stubble darkening his weathered skin. His hands, resting loosely near his gun belt, were scarred and wrapped in thick leather work gloves. He did not look like the prosperous, gentlemanly ranch owner his terse, neatly typed letters had implied. He looked like the untamed land itself, harsh, unyielding, and entirely dangerous. "You're the mail order?" His voice was a low rumble, rough as dragging sandpaper across oak. Victoria straightened her spine, a habit drilled into her by a dozen finishing school instructors. "Victoria Sterling," she corrected, her voice carrying the crisp, educated enunciation of the East Coast elite. "And you must be Silas Vance. We signed the papers by proxy 3 weeks ago." Silas stared at her. His gaze swept over the velvet-trimmed hat, the tightly corseted waist, and the pristine, now mud-stained dress. The disappointment hit him like a physical blow, tightening his chest. He needed a woman who could wield an axe, tend a garden in a drought, and survive a winter that routinely froze men to death in their saddles. He had explicitly asked the agency for a sturdy, practical partner for survival. Instead, they had sent him a porcelain doll who looked like she would shatter if she rode a horse faster than a trot. "You won't last a week," Silas muttered. It wasn't an insult, it was a simple, grim statement of fact. He stepped forward and hoisted her massive iron-bound travel trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed no more than a sack of flour. He reached with his free hand for her leather briefcase, but Victoria snatched it back, pulling it flush against her chest like a shield. "I will carry this, Mr. Vance," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Silas paused, his eyes narrowing slightly under the brim of his hat. He didn't argue. Less talking meant less time wasted, and time was something he was rapidly running out of. He turned on his heel and walked toward a weathered buckboard wagon hitched near the water trough. Victoria followed. He didn't offer a hand to help her up onto the high wooden bench. She didn't ask for one. Gathering her heavy skirts in one hand, she hauled herself up, settling her briefcase firmly on her lap. The ride to the Vance ranch was 10 miles of bone-rattling ruts and absolute suffocating silence. Silas kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands managing the team of horses with effortless, quiet strength. A week, he told himself again, listening to the rustle of her ridiculous dress every time the wagon hit a bump. She'll be crying for a train ticket back east by Sunday. He didn't have the time or the money to babysit a runaway debutante. The bank was breathing down his neck. Bartholomew Thorne's hired thugs were circling his property line like buzzards, and the weight of his father's debts was drowning him. Now, he had a wife who looked like she belonged on a wedding cake, not a working cattle spread. Beside him, Victoria stared at the sprawling, desolate landscape, acutely aware of the man's silent judgment. He thought she was useless. Everyone always did. That was the profound beauty of being a woman in high society. Men were so easily blinded by silk and pleasant smiles that they never bothered to look for the steel underneath. They certainly never saw the mathematical prodigy who had secretly managed and saved her father's shipping empire from bankruptcy, only for him to try and sell her into an arranged marriage with a cruel, power-hungry politician as a reward. She stroked the smooth, worn leather of her briefcase. It didn't hold embroidery patterns or books of poetry. It was packed tight with heavy ledgers, fountain pens, blank legal contracts, and a small fortune in hidden bank drafts she had quietly siphoned from her own legitimate earnings. She had bought a husband through the mail because she needed a legal proxy and a place far enough away that Boston's elite couldn't reach her. She had expected a quiet, manageable life. When the wagon crested the final ridge, the Vance Ranch came into view. Victoria's breath caught, but not from awe. It wasn't a thriving estate. It was a sprawling, breathtaking sweep of raw, wild land, anchored by a weathered cabin that looked one bad storm away from total collapse. The corral fences were splintering. The barn leaned precariously to the left, and the silence of the frontier felt heavy enough to crush a person. Silas brought the wagon to a halt in the dusty yard. He set the brake and sat there, his hands resting on his thighs. He didn't look at her. He was waiting for the inevitable tears, the demands to be taken back to civilization, the realization that she had made a terrible mistake. Victoria stood up in the wagon bed. The harsh western wind whipped her ruined emerald skirt around her ankles and tore a loose strand of hair from her perfect updo. She looked at the rotting wood of the porch, the vast, empty sky, and the rugged, silent man sitting stubbornly beside her. She didn't see ruin. She saw a blank ledger. "Well, Mr. Vance," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the wind, clear and sharp as a diamond as she stepped down into the dust. "We have a great deal of work to do." The interior of Silas Vance's cabin was as unyielding as the man himself. Silas dropped Victoria's heavy iron-bound trunk at the foot of an iron-frame bed pushed against the far wall. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the sound loud in the suffocating quiet of the single-room dwelling. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the rough-hewn floor, and no warmth in the hearth. A cast-iron stove dominated the center of the room, flanked by a scarred wooden table and two mismatched chairs. It was the house of a man who worked until he dropped, slept only because his body demanded it, and cared nothing for comfort. "I'll take the barn," Silas said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on the latch of the heavy wooden door. "There's a pump out back for water. Dry goods in the pantry. If you hear coyotes, stay inside." Before Victoria could reply, he stepped out, pulling the door shut with a solid, echoing thud. Victoria stood alone in the center of the room. A lesser woman of her station might have collapsed onto the bare mattress and wept. Instead, Victoria reached around to the back of her dress and began the arduous process of unfastening her ruined emerald taffeta. 15 minutes later, stripped of her suffocating corset and heavy outer skirts, she wore only her simple cotton chemise, a sturdy woolen traveling skirt, and a look of absolute determination. She rolled her sleeves up past her elbows. If this was to be her fortress, it needed a fire. She found the wood box beside the stove, but the kindling was sparse. Searching for paper to catch the initial spark, her eyes landed on a solitary shelf above the table. It held a tin coffee pot, a cracked mug, and a single thick book, Modern Cattle Breeding and Range Management. Victoria pulled the book down. As she opened the front cover to check for loose, useless pages, a heavy, folded envelope slipped from between the leaves and hit the floorboards with a soft slap. She knelt to pick it up. The paper was high-quality parchment, out of place in the dust and grit of the cabin. Her fingers brushed the embossed seal of the Red Creek Territorial Bank. Victoria hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Privacy was a luxury for people who were not fighting for their lives. She slipped the documents from the envelope. There were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a preliminary offer letter, dated 14 months prior, signed in the elegant sweeping hand of Bartholomew Thorne, bank president. It outlined a loan of $4,000 against the Vance Ranch deed. Victoria's eyes automatically scanned the figures, her mind locking onto the terms with the ease of a master pianist reading sheet music. 8% interest, compounded annually. A steep but manageable rate for a working cattle spread. She unfolded the second paper, the finalized, signed contract. Silas Vance's signature was at the bottom, the strokes hard and heavy, the ink pressed deep into the paper by a man who was likely burying his pride along with his debt. Victoria's gaze flicked to the interest section. She froze. 12%. She moved closer to the window, catching the fading afternoon light, and angled the document. Her father had once fired 3 accountants for embezzlement. Victoria had been the one to catch them. She knew what to look for. The number 12 sat perfectly on the line, but the ink of the 1 and the 2 caught the light with a slightly different sheen than the surrounding text. The pen pressure was marginally lighter. It was a masterful forgery done after the document had been signed. Someone had taken a razor blade to the original 8, scraped the fibers thin, and carefully inked the new ruinous number over the weakened paper. At 12% compounded, Silas wasn't just paying a debt. He was bleeding to death. Within 3 years, the balloon payment would be impossible to meet, and the bank would seize the land legally. The cabin door swung open. Silas stopped in the threshold. He had come back to drop off a sack of flour he'd forgotten in the wagon, fully expecting to find her huddled in the corner. Instead, he found his mail-order bride standing by the window in her shirt sleeves, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders, holding his most private, humiliating failure in her hands. His face went hard, the jaw muscles ticking dangerously. "Put that down." Victoria didn't flinch. She turned to face him, the documents held firmly in her grasp. "Mr. Vance, when did you sign this contract?" Silas dropped the flour sack onto the table. The loud thump was a warning. "I said put it down. My finances are none of your concern, Boston. As your legally wedded wife, your debts are precisely my concern," Victoria countered, her voice ringing with the cold, hard authority of the boardroom. She stepped toward him, tapping the parchment. "Did you read this document before you signed it?" "I know how to read," Silas snarled, his pride stung. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, towering over her. He smelled of horse sweat, leather, and sharp winter air. "It was 8%. I was burying my father that week. Thorne had the papers ready. I signed them." "And when did you realize Thorne changed it to 12? Silas stopped, his hand freezing halfway in its reach to snatch the papers from her. His eyes, a stormy pale gray, locked onto hers. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and heavy. 6 months ago, he said, the admission rough, scraped from the bottom of his throat. When the first revised payment schedule came in. "This is a material alteration of a financial contract," Victoria said, her mind already calculating the legal precedents, the necessary filings, the countersuits. "It is fraud. Why didn't you go to the territorial judge? Why haven't you contested this?" Silas let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. He stepped back, running a calloused hand over his jaw. "You think you're the first one to figure out Bartholomew Thorne plays with loaded dice? You think you can just march into his office with a polite complaint and fix it? If you have the proof." "Proof doesn't stop bullets, Victoria." Silas's voice cracked like a whip in the small room. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on the table, his face inches from hers. The raw, desperate anger in his eyes made her breath catch. "Old man Miller lived 3 miles east of here. He noticed a material alteration on his deed last spring. He went to the sheriff. 2 nights later, Miller and his 2 sons burned to death in their barn. The sheriff called it a tragic accident. Victoria stared at him, the reality of the frontier finally crashing through the neat, ordered world of her ledgers. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was a war. Thorne wasn't just a thief, he was a butcher in a tailored suit. Silas straightened up, his chest heaving slightly. He looked at her pale face and the fragile lace of her chemise, a sudden wave of exhaustion washing over him. I bought a wife so I'd have someone to leave the deed to if Thorne's men catch me on the road. That's the truth of it. You want to survive? Keep your head down, cook the meals, and stay out of town. He reached out and plucked the contract from her hands. He turned to leave, dismissing her entirely. Mr. Vance. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a specific gravity that made him stop in his tracks. Silas looked back over his shoulder. Victoria was standing perfectly straight, her chin raised. The Boston debutante was gone. In her place was a woman who had survived the vicious, cutthroat world of East Coast shipping magnates and walked away with a fortune they didn't even know she had stolen. A man who burns down barns does so because he is afraid of the light, Victoria said evenly. She walked over to her leather briefcase, popped the brass latches, and opened it to reveal the dense, pristine stacks of accounting ledgers, legal treatises, and blank bank drafts. She looked up, meeting his stormy gray eyes with an unwavering stare of her own. You told me to keep my head down, she said, her lips curving into a dangerous, breathtaking smile. But I assure you, Silas, I did not travel 2,000 miles to surrender to a man who relies on parlor tricks and matches. We are not paying a thief. We are going to ruin him. For 3 days, the Vance Ranch was a battlefield of silent wills. Victoria did not complain about the blistering cold that seeped through the cabin walls, nor did she mention the angry red blisters forming on her palms from chopping kindling. She simply woke before dawn, wrestled with the cast-iron stove until it surrendered a fire, and attacked the domestic labor with the same ruthless efficiency she had once applied to her father's shipping manifests. Silas watched her from the periphery, his silence a heavy, brooding thing. He was waiting for her to break. Women who smelled of French milled soap and wore kid-leather boots did not survive on the frontier. It was a simple law of nature. Nature, however, had not accounted for Victoria Sterling. The truce broke on the 4th night, heralded by a sudden violent spring blizzard. The wind shrieked off the mountains, driving sleet against the cabin windows like handfuls of gravel. Silas had been in the barn since supper. When he didn't return by midnight, Victoria wrapped herself in a heavy wool blanket over her nightdress, lit a kerosene lantern, and pushed her way out into the howling dark. The cold hit her lungs like shattered glass, but she fought her way across the frozen yard, hauling the heavy barn door open against the gale. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweet hay, manure, and fresh blood. "Silas!" she called out over the roar of the wind. "Back here!" His voice was strained, tight with panic. Victoria hurried down the central aisle. In the last stall, bathed in the golden flickering light of a hanging lantern, Silas was on his knees in the blood-soaked straw. His duster was thrown over the partition, his shirt sleeves pushed up to his biceps, his arms slick with gore. Beneath him, a beautiful roan mare was thrashing, her eyes rolling white in terror, as she let out a desperate, echoing whinny. "The foal is breached," Silas grunted, his face pale beneath the dirt and shadow. "One foreleg is back. I can't get my hand in far enough to turn it without tearing her apart. My hands are too big." He looked up at her, his storm-gray eyes completely stripped of their usual guarded stoicism. He looked helpless. "I'm going to lose them both." Victoria didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the filth or the cold, or the fact that she had never touched a farm animal in her life. She looked at the dying mare, and she looked at the man who had built his life around this land. She dropped her blanket. Silas blinked in shock as his mail-order bride, clad only in a thin white cotton nightdress, marched into the stall. She grabbed a bucket of warm water he had pumped earlier, scrubbed her hands and arms up to the elbows with a harsh block of lye soap, and knelt directly into the bloody straw beside him. "Tell me what to do," she demanded, her voice an absolute command. "Victoria, you can't—" "Silas Vance, if you waste one more second arguing with me, I will shoot you myself. Where is the leg?" For a second, Silas just stared at the fierce, blazing determination in her dark eyes. Then he swallowed hard and guided her hand. "Reach in, find the shoulder, trace it down to the knee, and pull it forward, gently. If she contracts, hold perfectly still." Victoria closed her eyes, blocking out the stench and the freezing air, focusing entirely on the tactile puzzle beneath her fingertips. The heat inside the mare was stifling. She pushed deeper, her slender arm sliding in where Silas's broad shoulders had prevented him. The mare screamed and contracted, crushing Victoria's arm against the pelvic bone. The pain was blinding, but Victoria bit her lip until she tasted copper, refusing to make a sound. She held her ground. As the muscle relaxed, her fingers brushed the knobby joint of the foal's trapped knee. "I have it," she gasped, her forehead pressed against the mare's sweating flank. "I'm turning it." With agonizing slowness, applying a steady mechanical leverage she had learned from studying pulley systems on Boston docks, Victoria manipulated the delicate leg forward. "Now," Silas commanded, shifting his weight. "Pull on the next contraction." They moved as one. When the mare heaved, Victoria pulled, and Silas guided the foal's head. With a sudden wet rush, the foal slid free onto the straw, a tangled, steaming mass of long legs and dark hair. Silas immediately fell upon it, clearing the sack from its muzzle. A heartbeat later, the barn was filled with the fragile, sputtering cough of a newborn taking its first breath. Victoria slumped back against the wooden partition, her nightdress ruined, her hair plastered to her face with sweat, and her arms coated in blood up to the elbows. She was shivering violently now that the adrenaline was fading. Silas sat back on his heels, watching the mare weakly nudge her struggling foal. Then he turned to Victoria. The lantern light carved deep shadows across his face, but there was no missing the profound seismic shift in his gaze. He looked at her chest heaving beneath the stained cotton, at the blood smeared across her aristocratic cheekbone, and the iron will still burning in her eyes. He had expected a porcelain doll. He had married a steel blade. Without a word, Silas stood, stripped off his own dry flannel shirt and crouched beside her. He wrapped the warm, heavy fabric around her trembling shoulders, pulling the collar tight beneath her chin. His large, calloused hands lingered for a fraction of a second on her collarbone, the heat of his skin searing right through the flannel. "You did good, Boston," he said softly, his voice a dark, rough velvet in the quiet barn. Victoria looked up at him, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with the birth they had just performed. "I told you, Mr. Vance. I did not travel 2,000 miles to surrender." By noon, 2 days later, the blizzard had passed, leaving the territory buried under a blindingly bright layer of melting snow. Silas was hitching the wagon. They needed grain, coffee, and liniment for the mare. Victoria emerged from the cabin, and Silas nearly dropped the leather traces. She was wearing a walking suit of midnight blue velvet, trimmed in black silk braid, with a matching hat pinned at a jaunty angle over her perfectly coiffed hair. She held a small, useless parasol and a reticule beaded with jet glass. In the middle of the muddy, thawing Wyoming frontier, she looked like she had just stepped out of a Parisian fashion plate. "What in the hell are you wearing?" Silas asked, his brows pulling together in a dark scowl. "Armor, Silas," Victoria said smoothly, accepting his hand for the first time to step up onto the wagon bench. She settled her skirts with a deliberate theatrical rustle. "We are going to town to purchase supplies, and we are going to make a deposit at the Red Creek Territorial Bank." Silas froze, his jaw tightening. "I told you to leave Thorne alone." "I am not confronting him," Victoria said, opening her parasol to shield her face from the harsh glare of the snow. She looked at him from beneath the brim, her eyes sparkling with a dangerous, brilliant cunning. "I am merely introducing myself as the vapid, foolish, easily distracted woman he expects a mail-order bride to be. A man like Bartholomew Thorne thrives on underestimating people. Let him underestimate me." Silas didn't like it. Every instinct screamed at him to keep her far away from the snake holding his deed. But as he looked at the confident set of her jaw, he remembered the blood on her hands in the barn. He clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward. The town of Red Creek was a hive of muddy activity. Silas tied the team in front of the bank, a 2-story brick building that sat on the corner like a bloated tick, fat with the town's misery. The moment Victoria stepped through the heavy oak doors, her entire demeanor shifted. Her spine lost its steel rod, her shoulders softened, and she let out a high, breathy sigh of exaggerated wonder. "Oh, Silas, darling, look at the wainscoting. Why, it's almost as charming as the little bank Papa uses on Beacon Hill." Silas choked on a cough, turning it into a grunt. The 3 clerks behind the brass teller's cage stopped counting coins to stare at the exquisite, brightly colored creature that had just fluttered into their dusty world. The door to the back office opened, and Bartholomew Thorne stepped out. Thorne was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. His black broadcloth suit was impeccably tailored, his gold pocket watch chain gleaming against a silk vest. He had the smooth, handsome face of a politician and the dead, flat eyes of a shark. "Well now," Thorne said, his voice slick as oiled glass as he stepped into the lobby. "Silas Vance, I didn't expect to see you in town until your revised payment was due. And who is this delightful vision?" "My wife," Silas said. The words tasted strange on his tongue, heavier than he expected. He stepped subtly in front of Victoria, a purely instinctual gesture of protection. "Victoria, we came to make a deposit." "A wife." Thorne's smile widened, revealing perfectly white teeth. He stepped around Silas, extending a manicured hand. "Bartholomew Thorne, Mrs. Vance, president of this establishment. I must say, Silas is a fortunate man, though I imagine our little town must be a dreadful shock to a woman of your obvious refinement." "Oh, Mr. Thorne, you have no idea," Victoria gushed, offering him her gloved hand. She fluttered her eyelashes, pitching her voice slightly higher, sounding utterly empty-headed. "The dirt! The smell! I told Silas I simply must have a proper parlor if I am to survive here. I was hoping to review our accounts to see if we might send for some decent chintz curtains from Chicago." Thorne chuckled, a patronizing sound that made Silas's blood boil. But Victoria shot Silas a covert, silencing look. "I'm afraid ranching is a hard business, my dear," Thorne said smoothly, leading them toward his office. "Silas's capital is quite tied up, but please, come in. Let the clerks handle the deposit. Can I offer you a cup of tea? Or perhaps a glass of sherry?" "Sherry would be divine," Victoria sighed, sinking gracefully into one of the leather chairs in front of Thorne's massive mahogany desk. As Thorne turned his back to pour the drinks at a side cabinet, Victoria's vapid smile vanished instantly. Her eyes locked onto the massive, open, leather-bound ledger sitting squarely in the center of his desk. She leaned forward, her gaze sweeping over the columns of numbers with terrifying speed. It wasn't just Silas. Javier Mendoza. Water rights annexation, pending default. Martha Higgins. Foreclosure initiated, deed transfer. Miller Estate, unclaimed, transferred to Red Creek Rail Conglomerate. The numbers didn't just tell a story of high interest rates. They told a story of a systematic, bloodless massacre. Thorne wasn't just stealing land. He was clearing a continuous corridor straight through the valley. He was consolidating the properties to sell the right-of-way to the railroad. "Here you are, Mrs. Vance," Thorne said, turning back around. Victoria was already leaning back in her chair, idly adjusting the lace on her cuff, looking profoundly bored. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Now, about those curtains." For 10 agonizing minutes, Silas stood entirely stiff, watching his brilliant, terrifying wife play the fool to absolute perfection, keeping Thorne's ego inflated and his attention diverted. By the time they walked out of the bank, Thorne was convinced Victoria was the most beautiful, useless woman to ever step foot in Wyoming. Silas didn't speak until they were back in the wagon and halfway to the edge of town. "What the hell was that?" Silas demanded, his voice low, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. Victoria dropped the parasol. The silly, breathy voice was gone. Her dark eyes were sharp, calculating, and cold as the winter ice. "Martha Higgins," Victoria said crisply. "Javier Mendoza, the Miller estate. He isn't just inflating loans, Silas. He is artificially defaulting specific properties that line the eastern ridge. He is trying to secure the entire valley's water access to sell a right-of-way to the railroad." Silas pulled back on the reins so hard the horses jolted to a stop in the middle of the road. He stared at her, stunned. "How do you know that?" "I read his open ledger while he was pouring the sherry," Victoria stated matter-of-factly. She looked up at him, the wind catching the edge of her velvet hat. "He needs Javier Mendoza's water rights to complete the corridor. If he gets them, he controls the valley, and he can choke the rest of you out legally. We have to stop him." Silas looked at the woman sitting beside him. She was wearing velvet and silk, but she had just robbed the most dangerous man in Red Creek blind without ever firing a shot. "How?" Silas asked. And for the first time, he wasn't arguing with her. He was asking for orders. Victoria's smile was small, dangerous, and utterly captivating. "First, we take a detour. I believe it is time we paid a visit to the widow Martha Higgins." The road to Martha Higgins' property was little more than a pair of muddy ruts, carved into the unforgiving Wyoming earth. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long skeletal shadows from the skeletal cottonwood trees that dotted the ridgeline. The spring thaw had turned the landscape into a treacherous mire, but Silas Vance drove the buckboard wagon with an effortless, unconscious mastery, his massive hands guiding the reins while his pale gray eyes continuously scanned the horizon. Beside him, Victoria Sterling sat perfectly upright. Her midnight blue velvet walking suit was already accumulating a fine layer of pale dust, but she paid it no mind. Her mind was a whirlwind of numbers, ledgers, and the damning evidence she had glimpsed in Bartholomew Thorne's office. "You're quiet," Silas noted, his rough voice breaking the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels. He didn't look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on a cluster of boulders a mile ahead. Since they had left Red Creek, the air between them had been thick with a new, unnameable tension. It was no longer the heavy silence of disappointment, but the charged, crackling quiet of two predators circling a shared prey. "I am calculating," Victoria replied smoothly. She adjusted her grip on her leather briefcase, which rested securely on her lap. "If Thorne's ledger is accurate, he has already foreclosed on 4 properties this quarter. All of them are strategically located along the eastern ridge. Javier Mendoza and Martha Higgins are the last 2 holdouts holding the lower valley's water access. If he takes them, the railroad has a straight, uncontested line through the county." Silas's jaw tightened. "And he gets paid a fortune by the rail conglomerate for the right-of-way." "Exactly. It is a classic consolidation scheme," Victoria said, her tone as clinical as a surgeon's. "My father's associates in Boston used similar tactics to buy out waterfront warehouses. You inflate the debts, manufacture defaults, and force a fire sale. The difference is, in Boston, they used aggressive banking laws. Here, Mr. Thorne appears to be using a razor blade and a bottle of ink." Silas pulled back on the reins slightly, slowing the team as they navigated a particularly deep washout. "And if ink doesn't work, he uses matches. You need to understand something, Victoria. Thorne isn't a Boston businessman who plays by gentlemen's rules. If you push him into a corner, he won't hire lawyers. He'll hire killers." Victoria turned her head, studying his sharp, uncompromising profile. "I am well aware of the risk, Silas. But if we do nothing, we lose the ranch anyway. I prefer to go down fighting." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. He had spent his entire life fighting the land, the weather, and his own pride. Hearing this delicate, beautiful woman speak of war with such casual certainty stirred something deep and dormant in his chest. Martha Higgins' place is over the next rise. Let me do the talking. She's particular. Particular, Victoria mused, raising an eyebrow. 10 minutes later, the wagon pulled into a farmyard that looked more like a military outpost than a cattle spread. The Higgins property was heavily fortified. The fences were reinforced with thick, spiked timber, and the windows of the main house were shuttered from the inside. Before Silas could even set the brake, the front door cracked open. The dull, heavy barrel of a Winchester rifle protruded through the gap, aimed directly at Silas's chest. "That's far enough, Vance," a gravelly, feminine voice barked from the shadows. Silas slowly raised his hands, completely unfazed. "Put the gun down, Martha. It's me." The door swung wider, revealing a woman in her late 40s. Martha Higgins wore men's canvas trousers, a heavy wool coat, and a scowl that could curdle milk. Her graying hair was pulled back into a severe knot, and her hands gripped the Winchester with practiced lethal familiarity. Her eyes darted to Victoria, narrowing in instant suspicion. "Who's the porcelain doll?" Martha demanded, not lowering the rifle an inch. "Thorne send you to do his collecting, Silas? Because if he did, you can tell him I've got enough lead to pay my debts in full." "She is my wife," Silas said calmly. Martha snorted, lowering the gun by a fraction. "Wife? When the hell did you get a wife? And where'd you find one dressed like she's going to a damn opera?" Victoria didn't wait for Silas to defend her. She stood up in the wagon, her velvet skirts rustling, and climbed down without assistance. She marched directly toward the porch, stopping just out of the rifle's effective swing radius. "Mrs. Higgins, my name is Victoria, and I am dressed like this because an hour ago I used this outfit to convince Bartholomew Thorne I was too stupid to realize I was reading his private financial ledger while he poured me a glass of sherry." Martha blinked. The rifle barrel dropped toward the dirt. "You did what?" "I read his ledger," Victoria repeated, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "And I know why your husband died thinking he had failed you, Mrs. Higgins. He didn't fail. He was robbed. Thorne altered your loan documents after your husband signed them, inflating your interest rate to manufacture a default." The silence in the yard was deafening. The wind howled through the eaves of the house, but Martha stood frozen, the color draining from her weathered face. Silas stepped down from the wagon, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Victoria. "You'd better come inside," Martha said, her voice suddenly hollow. The interior of Martha's house was sparse but obsessively clean. She poured them bitter black coffee and sat at the kitchen table while Victoria opened her briefcase. For the next hour, Victoria laid out the math. She drew columns, calculated the compound interest, and explained exactly how Thorne had manipulated the numbers to drain the Higgins estate of every spare dollar before declaring them in arrears. Martha stared at the pristine, elegant handwriting on Victoria's ledger paper. A single tear escaped the older woman's eye, cutting a clean track through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away furiously with the back of her hand. "My John," Martha whispered, her voice trembling with an anger so profound it shook the table. "He worked himself into an early grave trying to meet those payments. He died thinking he had ruined us. He apologized to me on his deathbed." Martha looked up, her eyes blazing with a terrifying, righteous fury. She looked from Victoria to Silas. "What do you need me to do?" "We need your original offer letter," Victoria said gently. "The one John received before he signed the final contract. We need to prove the discrepancy." Martha stood up, marched to a floorboard near the stove, pried it up with a knife, and pulled out a tin box. She handed a folded parchment to Victoria. "Take it. Take whatever you need. But if Thorne goes to trial, I want a front-row seat. And if he doesn't—" She glanced toward her Winchester leaning against the wall. "I'll settle the account myself." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Silas said, though the dark look in his eyes suggested he wouldn't mind if it did. "We need to get to Javier Mendoza's place before nightfall. If Thorne is calling in loans, Javier is next. They left Martha with a promise to return with a legal strategy. The drive to the Mendoza ranch was tense. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the western mountains, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple and bloody orange. Javier Mendoza's property was nestled in a low valley, bisected by a rushing, crystal-clear creek. It was the lifeblood of the surrounding land, a permanent water source that never ran dry, even in the harshest summers. When they arrived, Javier was loading a mule. The lean, dark-haired man looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He paused when he saw Silas, offering a weary, bitter smile. "Silas," Javier greeted, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're too late. I'm leaving. Thorne's men came by yesterday. Gave me 48 hours to vacate or they'd burn the house with my family inside." "Javier, wait," Silas said, jumping down from the wagon. "You don't have to run. We have proof Thorne is altering the contracts." Javier shook his head, looking past Silas to the mountains. "It's not just the money, Silas. It never was just the money, it's the water." Victoria stepped down, her analytical mind immediately seizing on the new variable. "Explain the water, Mr. Mendoza." Javier looked at the beautifully dressed woman with confusion, then back to Silas. Silas simply nodded. "Listen to her, Javier. She's the one who found the proof." Javier sighed, leaning against the mule. 6 months ago, Thorne had me sign a secondary addendum to my loan. He said it was standard procedure, a security measure for the bank. It was an annexation clause. If I defaulted, the bank didn't just take the land. They took exclusive, permanent riparian rights to the creek. Victoria's eyes widened. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. "Riparian rights. He isn't just taking your land, Mr. Mendoza. He's legally separating the water from the property. In the West, whoever controls the water controls everything downstream." "Exactly," Javier said bitterly. "Without my creek, the lower valley dries up. Silas, your eastern pastures rely on the runoff from my property. If Thorne diverts it, and he will, to feed the steam engines for the new rail line, your cattle will die of thirst in a month. He doesn't even have to foreclose on you. He'll just wait for you to go bankrupt." The sheer scale of Thorne's malice hung in the air. It was a masterstroke of financial and environmental warfare. "He's choking the entire valley," Silas murmured, his hands curling into fists. "One farm at a time." "He thinks he is," Victoria corrected, her voice cold steel. She looked at Javier. "Mr. Mendoza, unpack your mule. If you leave now, you abandon your claim, and the annexation clause executes immediately. If you stay and file a formal dispute of fraud against the primary loan, the territorial court is legally obligated to freeze the annexation until the investigation is complete." Javier looked at her, a spark of desperate hope warring with deep-seated terror. "He threatened my wife and children, Senora. They have guns." "And we have the law," Victoria said, stepping closer to him, her presence commanding despite her delicate appearance. "And we have numbers. Thorne relies on isolation. He picks you off one by one because you are fighting alone. If you, Martha Higgins, and Silas file a joint injunction, it becomes a federal matter. The rail conglomerate will not buy land wrapped up in federal litigation. We cut off his payday, we cut off his power." Javier stared at her, then looked at Silas. "Is she always like this?" "Usually she's more stubborn," Silas deadpanned, though the fierce pride in his eyes was unmistakable. Javier took a deep breath, looking back at his small farmhouse where his wife stood anxiously in the doorway. Slowly he began to unbuckle the packs from the mule. "I will give you the papers. But you had better be right, Mrs. Vance." By the time they secured Javier's documents and turned the wagon back toward the Vance ranch, night had fully descended. The frontier darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket broken only by the cold, indifferent light of a million stars. The air had turned freezing. Silas handed Victoria a heavy wool blanket from under the seat. She wrapped it over her velvet coat, shivering, but her mind was racing with legal filings and court dates. "We have them," Victoria said, her voice a hushed, triumphant whisper. "3 altered contracts. The annexation clause, the ledger entry. It's a clear pattern of racketeering." "Don't celebrate yet," Silas warned, his eyes scanning the impenetrable shadows of the pine trees lining the narrow canyon pass they were traversing. His posture was rigid, his senses fully extended. "Thorne's clerk saw us leave. They know we've been riding the ridge." "You think he would act so brazenly?" "I think a man about to lose $1 million railroad contract will do whatever he has to," Silas replied. He reached down to the floorboard and pulled up a lever-action Winchester rifle, resting it across his thighs. Victoria stared at the weapon, the reality of their situation snapping back into focus. Boston felt like a lifetime away. The canyon walls narrowed, the darkness deepening. The only sounds were the clopping of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon. Then Silas pulled back hard on the reins. The horses stopped, blowing nervously into the cold air. Victoria started to ask what was wrong, but Silas clamped a heavy, gloved hand over her mouth. "Quiet," he breathed, his eyes fixed on the ridge above them. The silence stretched. And then the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked echoed off the canyon wall. "Get down," Silas roared. He shoved Victoria violently off the bench, sending her tumbling into the wooden bed of the wagon just as the night exploded. A muzzle flash tore through the darkness above them, followed instantly by the deafening crack of a rifle. The wood of the wagon bench splintered exactly where Victoria's head had been a second prior. Chaos erupted. 2 more shots rang out from the opposite side of the road. The horses screamed, rearing up in their traces, threatening to overturn the buckboard. Silas didn't panic. His movements were terrifyingly fluid, the result of muscle memory forged in years of violence he rarely spoke of. He dropped the reins, swung the Winchester to his shoulder, and fired blindly toward the second muzzle flash. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the brush. "Hold on!" Silas shouted over the gunfire. He didn't try to turn the wagon around. The pass was too narrow. He snatched the reins back up, cracked them like a whip over the terrified horses, and yelled a guttural command. The team lunged forward, plunging the wagon wildly down the rocky road. Bullets chewed through the wooden sideboards. Victoria curled into a tight ball among the sacks of flour and grain, her hands covering her ears, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The velvet of her dress was torn, her pristine hat lost to the wind, but she didn't scream. She squeezed her eyes shut and held her breath. Above her, Silas stood half-crouched on the footboard, driving with one hand and firing the Winchester with the other. The sheer, raw power of the man was awe-inspiring. He was a force of nature, a demon of the frontier protecting his own. Another volley of shots came from a cluster of boulders ahead. They had set up a roadblock. 2 men on horseback stepped out into the moonlight, rifles raised to shoot the horses and stop the wagon dead. "Victoria, stay down!" Silas yelled. He dropped the Winchester, instantly drawing the heavy Colt revolver from his hip. He didn't aim, he simply pointed and fired in one smooth, continuous motion. The concussive blasts of the handgun were deafening. The first rider jerked backward, dropping his rifle as he tumbled from the saddle. The second rider managed to fire a wild shot before Silas's next bullet took his horse out from under him. The wagon barreled through the gap between the fallen horses, the wheels slamming over rocks and brush. Silas kept the team running at a breakneck pace for another 3 miles, not slowing down until they were out of the canyon and back on the open, moonlit plains leading to the ranch. Only when the lights of their own cabin appeared in the distance did Silas finally pull the exhausted, lathered horses to a halt. He sat frozen on the bench for a long moment, the smoking Colt still gripped tightly in his hand, his chest heaving with exertion. The silence of the night rushed back in, broken only by the ragged breathing of the horses. "Victoria?" His voice was hoarse, edged with a raw panic he couldn't hide. Victoria slowly pushed herself up from the floor of the wagon. She was covered in dust. Her hair was a tangled disaster, and a nasty scrape wept blood along her cheekbone. but her eyes were wide and fierce. "I am unharmed," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. She looked at the splintered wood of the bench, then up at him. You saved my life." Silas let out a breath that sounded like a ragged curse. He turned fully toward her, holstering his weapon. But as he moved, a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped his lips. He slumped forward, his left hand clutching his right side. Victoria scrambled over the bench. In the pale moonlight, she saw the dark, wet stain spreading rapidly across the side of his heavy canvas coat. "Silas, you're shot!" "It's just a graze," he gritted out, though his face had gone dangerously pale. "Caught a piece of lead when we pushed through the roadblock. Let's get inside." He refused to let her help him unhitch the team, working through the pain with sheer, stubborn willpower. By the time they made it inside the cabin and Victoria managed to light the kerosene lantern, Silas was swaying on his feet. He collapsed heavily into one of the wooden chairs by the table, his breathing shallow. "Take the coat off," Victoria ordered. The aristocratic debutante was gone entirely. She was in survival mode. She rushed to the stove, stoking the embers and throwing on more wood to boil water. Silas managed to shrug out of the heavy duster, but the flannel shirt beneath was soaked with blood, sticking to his skin. He groaned as he tried to unbutton it with trembling fingers. "Stop. Let me," Victoria said. She stood in front of him, batting his hands away. Her own hands were shaking, but she forced herself to focus. She quickly undid the buttons and peeled the ruined shirt back, pulling it off his broad shoulders. The wound was ugly. The bullet had grazed his lower ribs on the right side, tearing a deep, jagged groove through the muscle before exiting. It was bleeding heavily, but it hadn't hit an organ. "You need to clean this, or it will fester," Victoria said, grabbing a clean linen towel from her trunk and dipping it into the basin of water she had warmed. "It's going to burn," Silas warned, his jaw tight. "I know. Bite down on this." She handed him a piece of clean leather strap from a harness. Silas put it between his teeth. Victoria pressed the hot, wet cloth firmly against the raw wound. Silas's entire body went rigid. The muscles of his chest and abdomen corded with tension, a low, animalistic groan vibrating in his throat. Victoria didn't flinch. She applied pressure, her hands steady, cleaning the dirt and cordite from the torn flesh. As she worked, the sheer physical reality of the man beneath her hands became impossible to ignore. His chest was broad and sculpted by years of brutal labor, covered in a light dusting of dark hair. His skin was hot to the touch, marred by old scars, remnants of a harsh life she was only beginning to understand. She was standing between his knees, leaning over him, the scent of his sweat, leather, and blood filling her senses. It was intoxicatingly raw. When the bleeding finally slowed, she quickly bound the wound with strips of clean cotton she tore from one of her own petticoats, pulling the bandage tight around his torso to secure it. "There," she whispered, tying off the knot. She didn't step back. Her hands remained resting lightly on his bare shoulders. Silas spat the leather strap onto the table. He took a ragged breath, looking up at her. Victoria's hair had fallen completely free of its pins, cascading over her shoulders in dark, heavy waves. The velvet dress was ruined, smeared with mud and his blood. The scrape on her cheek was stark against her pale skin. She had never looked more beautiful to him. "You didn't scream," Silas said, his voice a low, raspy murmur. The adrenaline was fading, leaving something much more dangerous in its wake. When the shooting started, most men would have screamed. You didn't make a sound. "Screaming does not stop bullets, Mr. Vance," Victoria replied softly, her dark eyes locked onto his. "You taught me that." Silas reached up, his large, calloused hand gently tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing just below the scrape on her cheek. The contrast between his rough skin and her soft face was staggering. "You should have stayed in Boston, Victoria," he whispered, the words an ache in his chest. "I brought you out here to a dying ranch, and I almost got you killed tonight. Not you. Thorn won't stop. It's going to get worse. I am not afraid of Bartholomew Thorn, Victoria said fiercely. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. And I have no intention of leaving. I told you, this is my home now. This is my fight. Why? Silas asked, his eyes searching hers, desperate to understand the fire that burned inside this exquisite, complicated woman. Why fight for a man you barely know? Because you didn't leave me in the wagon, she whispered, her gaze dropping briefly to his lips before rising back to his eyes. Because you bled for me. In my world, men use women as bargaining chips. You used your own body as a shield. The air in the cabin shifted, thickening with a sudden, overwhelming heat. The barrier of propriety of their arranged marriage, of the polite distance they had kept, it all shattered in the aftermath of the violence. Silas's hand slid to the back of her neck, tangling in her heavy hair. He didn't ask for permission. He pulled her down to him, and Victoria went willingly, eagerly. His mouth crashed down on hers. There was nothing gentle or polite about the kiss. It was wild, desperate, and fueled by the raw adrenaline of surviving the night. Silas kissed her like a man starving, his lips hot and demanding, pouring all the fear, relief, and sudden fierce possessiveness he felt into the embrace. Victoria gasped against his mouth, her hands sliding up his bare chest to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself in the storm. She kissed him back with equal fervor, opening to him, matching his desperate hunger. The taste of salt, sweat, and absolute survival was on his lips, and it ignited a fire in her blood that no Boston ballroom had ever sparked. He pulled her closer, ignoring the flare of pain in his side, wrapping his uninjured arm tightly around her waist until she was pressed flush against his chest. She was soft where he was hard, yet she possessed a strength that staggered him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The silence of the cabin was replaced by the heavy, ragged sound of their breathing. Silas looked deeply into her dark, brilliant eyes. He knew with absolute certainty that he was utterly ruined for any other woman. "If Thorn wants this land," Silas murmured, his voice a dark, lethal promise against her lips, "he'll have to kill me first." Victoria smiled, a fierce, predatory expression that made her look like a queen going to war. She ran her thumb gently over his lower lip. "Let him try," she whispered. "He has no idea what he is up against." The morning after the ambush broke crisp and blindingly bright, mocking the violence of the night before. Silas was out of bed before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. His side burned with a dull, throbbing fury, but he wrapped his ribs tight with Victoria's makeshift bandages, pulled on a clean shirt, and strapped his gun belt to his hips. There was no time for pain. When he walked out to the corral, he found Victoria already there. She had abandoned her ruined velvet and silk. Instead, she wore a simple, durable wool skirt she had altered overnight, paired with a heavy cotton work blouse. Her hair was braided tightly down her back. She was attempting to saddle the roan gelding, her delicate hands struggling with the heavy leather cinch. Silas stepped up behind her, his large hands covering hers. "You pull it through the ring twice, then tie off," he murmured, his chest brushing her back. The memory of their desperate, consuming kiss hung thick in the cold morning air, but the grim reality of daylight demanded their attention. "I need to learn," Victoria said fiercely, not pulling away from his warmth. "If I am to be a partner in this, I cannot be a liability." Silas turned her gently by the shoulders. "You saved my life last night, Victoria. You're no liability." His gray eyes darkened. But Thorn missed, and a man like that doesn't take kindly to missing. The truth of his words arrived less than 2 hours later. Silas and Victoria rode out to the eastern pasture where the Vance herd usually grazed along the creek fed by Javier Mendoza's property. Instead of grazing cattle, they found a nightmare. The creek water was coated in a sickly, iridescent film. Along the banks, 24 prime heifers lay dead in the mud, white foam crusted around their muzzles. The air smelled sharp and chemical. Silas swung down from his horse, his face a mask of cold, absolute fury. He knelt by the water, inspecting the chemical residue. "Arsenic!" he spat, his voice trembling with a rage so deep it shook his broad shoulders. "They dumped arsenic upstream during the night. The water's poisoned. The herd is dead." Victoria slid down from her saddle, her heart sinking as she surveyed the devastation. This was Thorne's retaliation. Since he couldn't kill them on the road, he was destroying their livelihood. Without the cattle, Silas had no income. Without income, the bank would foreclose in a matter of weeks. Silas stood up, kicking a stone into the poisoned water. He took off his hat, running a hand through his dark hair, looking suddenly unbearably exhausted. "That's it, then," he said, the fight draining out of him. "I can't replace the herd. I can't even afford the ammunition to guard the property line every night. I'm sorry, Victoria. I brought you into a graveyard." "Stop," Victoria commanded. She walked right up to him, grabbing the lapels of his duster. She forced him to look at her, her dark eyes blazing with an unyielding, terrifying light. "Bartholomew Thorne is a coward who poisons animals in the dark. We are not conceding to a coward." "Victoria, you don't understand the math." "I am the only one who understands the math, Silas Vance," she fired back. "Thorne thinks he has starved you out. He thinks you are a broke, desperate cowboy. He does not know you are married to me." Without waiting for a response, she mounted her horse and kicked it into a gallop back toward the cabin. Stunned, Silas mounted up and followed. When he pushed through the cabin door, Victoria had dragged her heavy, iron-bound trunk to the center of the room. She was wielding a hunting knife. Before Silas could ask what she was doing, she drove the blade into the beautiful silk lining of the trunk's lid and ripped it open. Silas froze. Hidden between the wood and the silk lining were thick, wax-sealed envelopes. Victoria pulled them out, tossing them onto the wooden table. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "What is that?" Silas asked, his voice low. "My dowry," Victoria said, slicing open the wax, "and my severance pay." She spread the contents across the table. Silas stared. They were bank drafts, bearer bonds, and federal certificates, all drawn from a secure, untraceable account in New York. There was enough money on that table to buy the Vance Ranch 5 times over. "My father thought I was spending my days embroidering cushions," Victoria said, her chin raised in defiance. "In reality, I managed the entire financial logistics of his shipping empire under a pseudonym. When he tried to force me to marry a monster, I liquidated my private accounts, converted them to bearer bonds, and boarded a train west." She looked up at Silas, who was staring at her as if she were a mythological creature. "I am not a damsel in distress, Silas," she said softly. "I am a war chest. And we are going to arm ourselves." By nightfall, they had ridden to an independent mining town 20 miles north of Red Creek, bypassing Thorne's spies. When they returned, the wagon was heavy. They hadn't bought cattle. They had bought crates of Winchester repeating rifles, cases of ammunition, dynamite, and enough provisions to survive a 6-month siege. The next morning, Silas set up a row of empty tin cans on the fence rail. He stood behind Victoria, adjusting her stance. She was wearing his spare canvas trousers, held up by suspenders over her blouse. "Feet shoulder-width apart," Silas instructed, his voice a low rumble right by her ear. He wrapped his large hands over hers, guiding her grip on the heavy Colt .45. "Don't anticipate the recoil. Squeeze the trigger. Let it surprise you." Victoria took a slow breath, feeling the solid, reassuring heat of his chest against her back. She aligned the iron sights, exhaled, and squeezed. The gun roared, bucking in her hands. A tin can 50 feet away violently spun off the rail. Silas let out a low whistle, a grin breaking through his usual stoicism. "Remind me never to make you angry, Boston." Victoria lowered the smoking gun, a fierce, exhilarating thrill rushing through her veins. She turned her head, her lips inches from his jaw. "Just ensure we are always shooting in the same direction, cowboy." They had the guns and they had the money. But Victoria knew brute force alone wouldn't strip Bartholomew Thorne of his power. They needed the master plan. The ledger I saw only listed the accounts, Victoria explained later that night, smoothing a crude map of Red Creek over the table. To secure a federal injunction, we need the actual railroad contract. We need the physical map detailing the right-of-way Thorne is selling to the conglomerate. Thorne wouldn't keep something that valuable at the bank, Silas said, cleaning his rifle in the dim lamplight. Too many clerks, too many eyes. Exactly. Where does a man like Thorne keep his true secrets? Silas paused, his rag stilling on the barrel. The Silver Spur Saloon. He owns the building. He keeps a private office on the second floor. Nobody goes up there except his personal muscle and the women he pays. Then that is where his private safe is, Victoria concluded, tapping the table. And that is where we are going tonight. Silas set the rifle down, his expression hardening. No, I'll go. Javier and I can. Javier cannot crack a Mosler combination safe, Silas. Neither can you, Victoria said reasonably. I know the mechanics of them. My father kept 3 in his study. If Thorne is as vain as I suspect, the combination is tied to his banking charter date. I have to be the one to open it. Silas hated the idea. The Silver Spur was a den of thieves, cutthroats, and Thorne's hired guns. But as he looked into Victoria's resolute eyes, he knew he couldn't stop her. She wasn't just his wife. She was his commanding officer in this war. 2 hours later, they rode into the outskirts of Red Creek under the cover of a moonless night. Javier Mendoza was waiting for them in an alley behind the saloon, his face painted with grim determination. Victoria had fully abandoned her high society trappings. She wore Silas's spare clothes, her hair tucked tightly up into a woolen cap, her face smudged with soot. In the dark, she looked like a scrawny teenage ranch hand. "Here is the plan," Silas said, his voice a hushed, lethal whisper in the alleyway. He handed Javier a shotgun. "Javier and I go through the front doors. We buy a drink. We find Thorne's men, and we start the biggest, ugliest fight this town has seen in a decade. We pull every set of eyes to the ground floor." He turned to Victoria, his hands gripping her shoulders tightly. "You take the fire escape up to the balcony. Get into the office, crack the safe, get the papers, and get out. You have exactly 10 minutes before the sheriff shows up to break up the fight. Do you understand?" 10 minutes, Victoria confirmed. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm, but her voice was ice cold. Silas pulled her into the shadows, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to her lips. It tasted of gunpowder and promises. "If anything goes wrong, you shoot through the floorboards. I'll come through the ceiling if I have to." Victoria nodded. With a final, lingering look, Silas and Javier stepped out of the alley and pushed through the swinging doors of the Silver Spur. Victoria slipped to the back of the building. The wooden fire escape creaked ominously beneath her boots, but the raucous noise from inside the saloon covered her ascent. She reached the second-floor balcony, finding the glass door leading to Thorne's private office. It was locked. Wrapping a handkerchief around the butt of her revolver, she smashed a single pane near the handle, reached in, and unlocked it. She slipped inside. The office was opulent, reeking of expensive cigars and brandy. And there, built solidly into the oak paneling behind Thorne's desk, was the heavy iron door of a Mosler safe. Below her feet, the floorboards suddenly vibrated. A man's shout rang out, followed instantly by the shattering of glass and the splintering of wood. Silas had started the war. Downstairs, it was absolute chaos. Silas had walked straight up to Thorne's lead enforcer, a massive brute with a scarred face, and smashed a whiskey bottle over his head. Javier flipped a poker table, sending chips, cards, and armed men flying. It wasn't a fight. It was a distraction of epic, violent proportions. Silas fought like a demon, his fists like anvils, ducking swinging chairs and throwing men through the saloon windows, keeping Thorne's entire payroll occupied. Upstairs, Victoria dropped to her knees in front of the safe. She pressed her ear to the cold iron, her fingers resting lightly on the brass dial. 10 minutes. She spun the dial. She knew the year Thorne secured his banking charter, 1874. She tried the numbers. Nothing. She bit her lip, sweat beading on her forehead as the sounds of brutal combat echoed from the floor below. Think, Victoria. The man is a narcissist. She reset the dial. She tried the coordinates of the rail line. Nothing. 5 minutes. She closed her eyes, tuning out the shouting downstairs. What did a man like Thorne value above all else? Not his bank. Not the railroad. Himself. She spun the dial to his birth year. Click. She spun it back to the date he arrived in Red Creek. Click. She turned it sharply to the right. Clack! The heavy iron bolts retracted. Victoria let out a shaky breath and pulled the heavy door open. Inside lay stacks of cash, but Victoria ignored them. She reached for the leather portfolios at the back. Pulling them out, she opened the first one. There it was, a master surveyor's map of the valley, with a thick red line drawn straight through the Mendoza, Vance, and Higgins properties, stamped with the seal of the Transcontinental Railway Corporation. Attached to it were the fraudulent deeds. "Got it," she whispered, shoving the documents into her satchel. "I wouldn't move, little lady." Victoria froze. The voice came from the doorway. She turned slowly. Standing in the shadows of the office was Sheriff Miller, his badge catching the dim light from the alley, a double-barreled shotgun leveled directly at her chest. "Thorne figured you and your husband were getting bold," the corrupt sheriff sneered, cocking both hammers of the shotgun. "Didn't think a high-class Boston whore would be the one doing the second-story work, though. Put the bag down." Victoria's hand hovered near the heavy Colt tucked into her waistband, but she knew she couldn't outdraw a shotgun already aimed at her heart. She slowly lowered the satchel to the floor. "You are protecting a man who murders his own neighbors, Sheriff," Victoria said, her voice remarkably steady, her mind calculating the distance between them. "I'm protecting my retirement," Miller chuckled, his finger tightening on the triggers. "Now turn around. I'm going to arrest you for burglary, and your husband's going to hang for murder when I tell the judge he shot you." Suddenly, the floor beneath them seemed to explode. A deafening boom ripped through the saloon. Silas hadn't waited for the sheriff. Downstairs, realizing the fight was taking too long, he had fired his Winchester straight up into the ceiling. Sheriff Miller flinched, his eyes darting to the floorboards for a fraction of a second. It was all Victoria needed. She didn't draw her gun. She threw herself sideways, diving behind Thorne's massive oak desk just as Miller fired. The buckshot shredded the air where she had been standing, obliterating Thorne's leather chair. Before Miller could fire his second barrel, the locked office door was kicked open with such violent force the hinges tore completely out of the frame. Silas stood in the doorway, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, his chest heaving, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying wrath. He saw the shotgun aimed at the desk where Victoria was hiding. Silas didn't hesitate. He brought his Colt up and fired twice. Miller dropped the shotgun, stumbling backward as the bullets caught him in the shoulder and leg. He collapsed against the wall, groaning in agony. Silas didn't spare him a second glance. He crossed the room in 2 strides, hauling Victoria up from behind the desk. His hands ran frantically over her arms, her face searching for blood. "Are you hit? Victoria, are you hit?" he demanded, his voice bordering on a roar. "I am fine," she gasped, grabbing the lapels of his torn shirt. She held up the leather satchel. "I have the maps. I have the contracts." "Then we're leaving." He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the balcony. Javier was already waiting in the alley with the horses, having slipped out the back door during the chaos. They scrambled down the fire escape just as Thorne's remaining men began pouring up the interior stairs. Silas tossed Victoria up into the saddle of her horse, swinging onto his own roan a second later. "Ride!" Silas bellowed. They spurred their horses into the pitch-black night, the sound of angry shouts and erratic gunfire fading behind them. Victoria leaned low over her horse's neck, the heavy satchel of evidence beating against her side. They had the proof. But as the cold wind whipped her face, Victoria knew the truth. They weren't just fighting a corrupt banker anymore. They had shot the sheriff. They had robbed a safe. The high society woman and the indebted cowboy were now officially the most wanted fugitives in the Wyoming Territory. And the real war had just begun. The Vance Ranch was no longer a dilapidated cattle spread. It was a fortress waiting for a war. Within an hour of their desperate escape from Red Creek, Silas and Victoria had barricaded the cabin. Heavy oak tables were shoved against the doors, and grain sacks were stacked beneath the windows to form firing parapets. Martha Higgins had arrived shortly after, her Winchester slung over her shoulder, and a bandolier of heavy ammunition strapped across her chest. Javier Mendoza had followed, his face set in grim lines, carrying a pair of double-barreled shotguns. Now the four of them sat in the suffocating darkness. The kerosene lanterns had been extinguished to prevent casting silhouettes against the windows. The only light came from the dying embers of the cast-iron stove. Outside, the Wyoming night was deceptively quiet, but Silas knew the silence was a lie. "They're out there," Silas murmured, peering through a narrow gap between the wooden shutters. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, the faint, flickering orange glow of torches painted the pines. "Thorne brought his whole payroll. They're waiting for the moon to dip behind the ridge. Then they'll try to burn us out." At the center of the room, illuminated only by a single shielded candle, Victoria sat on the floor with her leather briefcase open across her lap. The contrast was staggering. While Javier and Martha checked the actions of their rifles, Victoria was uncapping a fountain pen. She had the stolen railroad map spread over her knees alongside the fraudulent deeds and her own meticulous ledgers. "Let them wait," Victoria said, the scratch of her pen loud in the quiet cabin. "I need 30 more minutes to finish this affidavit. If it is going to a federal circuit judge, the citations must be flawless." Silas turned from the window, his chest tightening as he looked at her. Her face was streaked with soot and dried blood from the saloon escape, her hair a wild, tangled mane over her shoulders. Yet she was calmly citing federal racketeering statutes while an army of killers surrounded them. He crossed the room, kneeling beside her in the dim candlelight. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently covering hers, stopping the movement of her pen. Victoria looked up, her dark eyes meeting his pale gray ones. "Victoria," Silas said, his voice a raw, ragged whisper that barely carried over the crackle of the stove. "When I signed that marriage proxy, I thought I was bringing a woman to a hard life. But I brought you to a slaughterhouse. Thorne isn't going to let us walk out of here." "Silas—" "No, listen to me," he interrupted, his thumb brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His eyes were entirely unguarded, laying bare a soul that had been locked away in ice for years. "I've spent my whole life fighting for dirt and grass because it was all I had, but you gave up a fortune, a safe life in Boston, to bleed in the mud with a man who couldn't even protect his own cattle. I am so damn sorry I dragged you into this." Victoria stared at him. Then, to his utter shock, a soft, genuine laugh escaped her lips. It was a beautiful, brilliant sound that defied the death waiting outside their walls. "A safe life in Boston," she repeated, her voice dripping with affectionate disdain. She set her pen down and brought her hands up to cup his face, her thumbs tracing the harsh lines of his jaw. "Silas Vance. Boston was a cage made of gold and polite conversation. I was dying there, slowly, quietly, and completely." She leaned closer, the heat of her breath ghosting over his lips. "Do you want to know the truth? When you pulled me out of the line of fire tonight, when you bled for me, I have never felt more alive." "I'm not a victim of your circumstances, Silas. I am your partner. I love this land, and God help me, I love you." Silas's breath hitched. The admission slammed into his chest with the force of a runaway train. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her flush against him, kissing her with a desperate, crushing intensity that tasted of smoke, salt, and absolute devotion. It was a promise forged in the crucible of the frontier, a vow that whatever happened tonight, they belonged to each other. Suddenly, the glass of the front window shattered inward. A heavy glass bottle trailing a burning rag arced through the dark and smashed against the floorboards near the door. Liquid fire splashed across the wood. the smell of kerosene instantly filling the cabin. "Fire!" Martha yelled, already moving. The spell was broken. Silas shoved Victoria behind the heavy iron stove. "Stay down!" he roared. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket, throwing it over the flames and stamping them out before they could catch the dry timber of the walls. As the fire died, the darkness outside erupted. Dozens of muzzle flashes lit up the tree line like deadly fireflies. A hail of lead slammed into the cabin. Bullets tore through the shutters, splintering the oak tables, burying themselves in the walls, and ringing off the cast-iron stove like a demonic church bell. "Return fire!" Silas bellowed, racking the lever of his Winchester. Javier and Martha didn't need to be told twice. They unleashed a relentless barrage from the windows, the deafening roar of shotguns and rifles filling the small, smoke-choked room. Victoria didn't cower. She crawled to Silas's side, dragging a heavy crate of ammunition with her. She cracked it open and began methodically reloading the spent revolvers Silas tossed onto the floor, her hands moving with the same precise, unyielding rhythm she used to calculate columns of numbers. "There are too many of them!" Javier shouted over the din, ducking as a bullet shattered the water pitcher inches from his head. "They're trying to pin us down so they can bring up the dynamite!" Victoria jammed 6 rounds into a Colt cylinder and snapped it shut. She looked at the affidavit sitting on the floor, the wax seal she had just pressed into the parchment cooling in the dark. "Holding them off isn't enough," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the ringing in Silas's ears. She grabbed his arm. "Silas, the federal marshal's train passes through Red Creek at 5 o'clock in the morning. If this evidence isn't on that train, Thorne will burn us to ashes and bury the truth with us." Silas looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. It was 3 in the morning. Red Creek was a 10-mile ride through hostile territory. "I'll go," Silas said instantly, his eyes locked on the heavy satchel of evidence. "I can break through their line." "No," Victoria said, her grip on his arm tightening like a vice. "You are the best shot in this room, Silas. If you leave, Thorne's men will overrun the cabin in 10 minutes, and Martha and Javier will die. Furthermore, you are a massive target on a horse. I am 100 pounds lighter. The roan gelding can carry me twice as fast." "Victoria, absolutely not!" Silas roared, the fear for her life surging hot and violent in his veins. "They will cut you to pieces." "They have to see me to shoot me," she fired back, her eyes blazing with absolute conviction. "I know exactly what to say to the telegraph operator. I know the legal codes to force the marshal to halt the train. You cannot do this, Silas. I have to." Silas stared at her. He wanted to lock her in the cellar and throw away the key. But as he looked at the soot-stained warrior crouching beside him, he knew she was right. It was the brutal, unforgiving logic of the West. He swallowed the terror threatening to choke him and nodded once. "All right," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly, hollow register. "Pack the bag. Javier, Martha, consolidate your ammo at the front windows. When I give the word, we are going to unleash hell on the front line. We give her 3 minutes of absolute chaos." Victoria shoved the affidavit, the maps, and the ledgers into the leather satchel, buckling it tightly across her chest. She grabbed her loaded Colt, shoving it into her waistband. Silas pulled her toward the back door, leading to the small attached lean-to where they had secured the horses. He saddled the roan with terrifying speed, his hands shaking just slightly. He turned to her, lifting her by the waist and setting her into the saddle. He didn't say goodbye. He just looked up at her, his hands gripping her knees. "Ride low," Silas commanded, his voice cracking. "Don't look back. Don't stop for anything." Victoria leaned down, pressing a desperate kiss to his forehead. "I will come back to you, Silas Vance. I swear it." Silas stepped back. He drew both of his revolvers, turning toward the interior of the cabin. "Now!" Silas roared. The cabin erupted. Silas, Martha, and Javier opened up with a devastating, coordinated barrage of sustained fire from the front windows. Silas didn't just shoot. He threw a lit stick of mining dynamite 50 yards into the tree line. The explosion was catastrophic. A pillar of fire and earth leaped into the night sky, throwing Thorne's men into panicked disarray. The deafening shockwave rattled the teeth in Victoria's skull. It was her only chance. Victoria kicked the heavy back door of the lean-to open and spurred the roan. The horse lunged forward like a coiled spring, exploding into the freezing, pitch-black night. She didn't take the main road. Silas had taught her the topography of the ranch, the hidden dips and the treacherous arroyos. She guided the gelding blindly into the thick brush behind the property. Her body folded almost completely flat against the horse's sweating neck. Don't look back. For the first mile, she heard nothing but the thunder of the roan's hooves and the distant rhythmic popping of the gunfight at the cabin. The cold wind bit through her wool blouse, stinging her eyes, but she didn't blink. She urged the horse faster, navigating by the jagged silhouette of the western mountains against the starlit sky. Then she heard it, the unmistakable crack of snapping branches. Victoria glanced over her shoulder. 2 riders had broken off from the siege, their horses crashing through the brush in pursuit. The moonlight caught the glint of rifle barrels. They had spotted her. A bullet hissed past her ear so close she felt the violent displacement of air. "Yah!" Victoria screamed, driving her heels into the roan's flanks. The horse surged forward, tearing across the open plain. Victoria's heart was a war drum in her chest. She was a woman who had spent her life balancing ledgers in quiet, velvet-lined rooms. Now she was galloping through the brutal Wyoming wilderness, hunted by assassins. Another shot rang out. The bullet struck a boulder to her left, sending a shower of sharp stone fragments slicing into her arm. Victoria hissed in pain, but she didn't slow down. She realized with terrifying clarity that she couldn't outrun them on the straightaway. Their horses were fresh, and the roan had been saddled all night. She had to outsmart them. Ahead, the terrain broke into a narrow, twisting canyon carved by a dry riverbed, the same canyon where they had been ambushed days before. Victoria yanked the reins, steering the galloping horse off the flat plains and diving recklessly into the steep, rocky chute. The darkness here was absolute. The pursuers followed, their curses echoing off the canyon walls. Victoria drew the heavy Colt from her waistband. She couldn't aim in this darkness, but she didn't need to hit them. She just needed them to flinch. She twisted in the saddle, pointed the heavy revolver over her shoulder, and fanned the hammer twice. The muzzle flashes briefly illuminated the jagged canyon walls in bursts of blinding, strobe-like white light. The concussive roar of the gun in the enclosed space was terrifying. One of the men shouted in panic, his horse rearing wildly at the sudden flashes of light and sound. The horse lost its footing on the loose shale, sending rider and mount crashing heavily to the canyon floor in a tangle of limbs. Only one rider remained, and he was closing the distance. The canyon opened up, spilling out onto the flat dirt road that led directly into Red Creek. In the distance, the faint, pale glow of the town's street lamps flickered like a beacon. 3 miles. Victoria spurred the roan, pushing the magnificent animal to its absolute limit. The pursuer was relentless, raising his rifle. Victoria felt the horse stumble slightly beneath her, its breathing ragged. She was running out of time. She looked ahead. To her right was a dense thicket of cottonwood trees bordering the road. With a desperate, calculated gamble, Victoria veered the horse sharply off the road and plunged into the thicket. The pursuer followed, crashing through the branches. Suddenly, Victoria hauled back on the reins with all her might. The roan slid to a brutal, dust-choking halt in the shadows of the trees. Victoria threw herself out of the saddle, hitting the freezing dirt hard. She rolled, coming up to her knees behind the thick trunk of a massive cottonwood, raising her Colt with both hands. The rider burst through the brush, expecting her to be running ahead. He galloped right past her hiding spot. Victoria didn't hesitate. She fired. The bullet took the rider's horse in the hindquarter. The animal buckled, sending the man flying over its head. He hit the dirt road with a sickening crunch, sliding 10 feet before coming to a motionless halt. Victoria stayed frozen behind the tree for 5 agonizing seconds, her gun leveled, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The man didn't move. She lowered the gun. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. But there was no time to process the violence. She scrambled back onto the exhausted roan, guiding it back onto the road. The sky in the east was beginning to bleed from pitch black to a bruised, pale gray. Dawn was breaking. 5 o'clock. A long, haunting wail echoed across the valley. It was the whistle of the Union Pacific locomotive. The train was arriving. Victoria rode into Red Creek like a phantom. The town was asleep, the streets empty and silent. She aimed the horse straight for the train depot, a small wooden building sitting beside the iron tracks. The massive steam locomotive was already hissing at the platform, bleeding white steam into the freezing morning air. The conductor was walking down the platform, checking his pocket watch. Victoria didn't bother finding the hitching post. She threw herself off the horse while it was still moving, her boots hitting the wooden planks of the platform with a heavy thud. She was a horrifying sight. Her face bruised and smeared with mud, her clothes torn, her arm bleeding from the stone shrapnel, a heavy revolver clutched in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. The station master, stepping out of his office with a cup of coffee, froze, his eyes widening in absolute terror. Victoria marched straight up to him, slamming the heavy leather satchel down onto his wooden counter with the force of a gavel strike. "Where?" Victoria gasped, her voice hoarse, ragged, but ringing with the undeniable, imperious authority of a woman who commanded empires. "Is the federal marshal?" The station master swallowed hard, pointing a trembling finger toward the first-class passenger car. Car number 3, ma'am. But you can't—" Victoria didn't wait. She turned on her heel and marched toward the train, the sun finally breaching the horizon, casting her long, unyielding shadow across the platform. She was going to end Bartholomew Thorne. And then she was going home to her cowboy. The interior of the first-class Pullman car was a study in polished mahogany, velvet upholstery, and the quiet, insulated wealth of the East. When Victoria kicked the heavy brass-handled door open, she shattered that piece entirely. Federal Marshal Everett Hayes, a broad-chested man with silver hair and a mustache that hid a perpetually stern mouth, was mid-bite into a buttered biscuit when the apparition appeared before him. She was bleeding, coated in a thick layer of Wyoming dust, and breathing like a hunted animal. Her skirt was torn and her hair hung in wild, dark tangles. Yet, as she marched down the aisle, the heavy Colt revolver tucked brazenly into her waistband and her chin held at a regal, imperious angle, Marshal Hayes slowly lowered his biscuit. He recognized absolute, unyielding authority when he saw it. Victoria slammed the heavy leather satchel onto the polished table in front of him, upsetting his coffee cup. "Marshal Hayes," Victoria said, her voice a ragged rasp that commanded the entire rail car. "My name is Victoria Sterling Vance. Inside this satchel is irrefutable primary source evidence of federal racketeering, contract forgery, and attempted murder orchestrating a massive land grab for the Transcontinental Railway. And if you do not order this train's armed guards to mount up and follow me this exact second, my husband is going to die." Hayes stared at the blood dripping slowly from the shallow cut on her arm, then down to the wax-sealed affidavit resting atop the stolen ledgers. He didn't ask if she was hysterical. He didn't ask for her husband's permission. He looked at the flawless, damning mathematics of the ledger exposed on the table, and he stood up. "Deputy!" Hayes roared, his voice booming through the car. "Requisition every horse at the livery. Deputize the rail guards. We ride in 3 minutes." 10 miles away, the Vance ranch was burning. Silas was down to his last 6 bullets. The front oak tables were splintered into useless kindling, the windows were gone, and the heavy sulfur stench of gun smoke was thick enough to choke on. Javier was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, and Martha had resorted to using her empty Winchester as a club to brace the back door. Thorne's men had set the barn alight. The flames leaped into the dawn sky, casting a hellish, flickering orange glow over the yard. It was only a matter of time before they managed to throw a torch onto the cabin roof. "Silas," Javier coughed, leaning against the bullet-riddled wall. "I am out." Silas checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 rounds. He snapped it shut. His side was screaming in agony, his shirt soaked with fresh blood where the wound had reopened, but his face was carved from granite. He looked at the men closing in on the porch. "You both get into the cellar," Silas ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm. He drew his heavy hunting knife with his left hand, holding the Colt in his right. "When they breach the door, I'll take the first wave. You wait until they're busy with me, then run for the creek. Like hell, I'm hiding in a hole Martha spat, pulling a heavy iron skillet from the stove. The front door groaned under the weight of a heavy wooden beam being used as a battering ram outside. Crack! The hinges buckled. Silas leveled his gun, his heart locking onto the memory of Victoria's face, praying to God she was safe. He cocked the hammer. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the fire. It wasn't gunfire. It was the synchronized, thunderous drumming of 40 horses galloping at full speed. A piercing whistle blew over the din. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons and step away from the house!" Silas lowered his gun, his breath catching in his throat. Through the splintered gaps in the wall, he saw them. A literal cavalry of federal deputies swept into the yard, rifles raised. Thorne's hired thugs, realizing they were suddenly outgunned by federal authorities and facing the hangman's noose, threw their guns into the dirt, raising their hands in surrender. And riding right beside the federal marshal, on a lathered, exhausted roan gelding, was Victoria. Silas didn't wait. He kicked the ruined front door open and stepped out onto the porch. When Victoria saw him standing there, bloody but alive, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief tore from her throat. Marshal Hayes secured the prisoners, but the war wasn't over. "Mrs. Vance's affidavit names Bartholomew Thorne and Sheriff Miller as the architects of this syndicate," Hayes announced over the chaos. "Mount up, Vance. We're going to town." It was high noon when the federal posse rode into Red Creek. The sun beat down on the muddy main street, baking the earth into hard, cracked ridges. The townspeople had locked their doors, peering through the cracks in their shutters as Marshal Hayes's men surrounded the Red Creek Territorial Bank. Bartholomew Thorne was dragged out by 2 deputies, his immaculate black suit rumpled, his slick veneer of aristocratic invulnerability finally cracking. They had found him frantically trying to pack a carpetbag with gold reserves from the vault. Sheriff Miller, still bleeding from Silas's bullet the night before, was hauled out of the doctor's office in irons. "Bartholomew Thorne," Marshal Hayes proclaimed, his voice echoing off the brick buildings. "You are under federal arrest for fraud, racketeering, and the attempted murder of the Vance, Mendoza, and Higgins families." Thorne's dark, shark-like eyes darted frantically around the street. The game was up. The federal warrant was ironclad. Victoria's ledgers had ensured he would never see the outside of a prison cell again. But as his gaze locked onto Silas Vance, who had just dismounted his horse 10 yards away, a vicious, cornered malice twisted Thorne's handsome face. He wasn't going to rot in a federal penitentiary without taking the man who broke him down to hell first. "You think you've won, Vance?" Thorne spat, his voice laced with venom. "You think a Boston whore and some stolen paperwork make you a man? You're nothing but a dirt-poor cowboy who had to hide behind his wife's skirts to save his miserable patch of weeds." Victoria, standing safely behind Marshal Hayes, stiffened, but Silas didn't even blink. He took a slow, deliberate step forward into the center of the street. "Shut your mouth, Thorne," Silas said. The absolute, lethal quiet of his voice made the hair on the back of Victoria's neck stand up. Thorne sneered. He knew the unspoken rules of the frontier better than the federal men did. He looked at the marshal. "I am a gentleman of standing in this territory, Marshal. And this man has slandered my name, assaulted my employees, and destroyed my property. I demand the right to settle this dispute as a man of honor, a duel, right here, right now." Marshal Hayes scoffed. "This isn't the Dark Ages, Thorne. You're going to trial in chains." "Let him," Silas said. The entire street went dead silent. Victoria's heart slammed against her ribs. "Silas, no!" she cried out, stepping forward. "He is desperate. You don't have to prove anything to him." Silas didn't look back at her. His eyes were locked onto Thorne with the cold, unblinking intensity of a wolf. "He burned my barn. He poisoned my cattle. He shot at my wife. The law can have whatever is left of him when I'm done." Marshal Hayes looked at the terrifying resolve in Silas's eyes, then at Thorne, who was smiling a grim, triumphant smile. Hayes stepped back, signaling his deputies to clear the street. "Your funeral, Thorne." A deputy unholstered Thorne's pearl-handled revolver, checked that it held a single round, and handed it to the banker. Silas stood 30 paces away, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, brushing the leather of his holster. The midday sun beat down relentlessly. A single bead of sweat rolled down Thorne's temple. Silas was a statue, carved from the very rock of the mountains behind him. "On my count," Marshal Hayes announced, stepping onto the boardwalk. "1, 2. Thorne didn't wait for 3. He was a cheat to his core. As Hayes drew breath for the final number, Thorne's hands snapped up, raising the pearl-handled gun with terrifying speed, aiming squarely at Silas's chest. Victoria screamed, but Silas Vance was a legend in the valley for a reason. Before Thorne's arm was even fully extended, Silas moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for the eye to track. The heavy Colt cleared leather, leveled, and fired in a fraction of a heartbeat. Bang! Thorne's gun discharged wildly into the dirt. The banker jerked violently backward as Silas's bullet shattered his right collarbone, tearing the pearl-handled gun from his grip. Thorne collapsed into the mud, screaming in agony, his shoulder a ruin of blood and bone. Silas stood perfectly still, the smoke drifting lazily from the barrel of his Colt. He hadn't shot to kill. He had shot to disarm, ensuring Thorne would live a long, miserable life in a federal cell, forever robbed of the use of his right hand. Silas slowly holstered his weapon. Victoria didn't care about the mud, the blood, or the watching deputies. She hiked up her ruined woolen skirt and ran into the center of the street. Silas turned just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. He buried his face in her dark, tangled hair, his massive arms wrapping tightly around her waist, lifting her entirely off the ground. "You kept your promise," Silas whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking as the adrenaline finally left his body, leaving only the overwhelming, terrifying reality of how much he loved her. Victoria pulled back just enough to look at his soot-stained, blood-streaked face. She smiled, a radiant, triumphant expression that rivaled the midday sun. "I am an accountant, Mr. Vance," she said softly, her hands framing his jaw. "I always balance my ledgers." And right there, in the middle of the muddy street of Red Creek, surrounded by federal marshals and a cheering town, Silas Vance kissed his mail-order bride. 6 months later, the crisp, biting chill of the Wyoming autumn hung in the air, but the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The scars of the spring violence had slowly faded from the land, replaced by the golden hues of the harvest season. Bartholomew Thorne was currently residing in a maximum security federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Sheriff Miller occupied the cell next to him. The Transcontinental Railway, desperate to avoid a federal scandal, had completely abandoned their hostile right-of-way expansion, negotiating instead to build their tracks 20 miles north, leaving the valley untouched. Javier Mendoza's creek flowed freely, watering the entire eastern ridge, and Martha Higgins had successfully filed to double her acreage using the restitution funds ordered by Judge Hayes. But the most profound transformation had taken place on the Vance Ranch. Victoria stood on the expansive, freshly swept porch of their newly built home. It was no longer a drafty one-room cabin. Using a fraction of her New York bank drafts, Silas and Javier had built a beautiful, sprawling 2-story farmhouse with sturdy oak floors, wide windows that caught the morning light, and a massive stone hearth that kept the biting cold at bay. She wasn't wearing velvet or silk. Victoria wore a simple, beautifully tailored dress of deep burgundy cotton, her dark hair pulled back in a practical, elegant twist. In her hands, she held her beloved leather-bound ledger. She ran her finger down the final column of the month's accounting. The numbers were flawless. The new herd of prime Hereford cattle they had purchased was thriving, the winter feed was stockpiled, and the ranch was operating at a spectacular profit. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden steps made her look up. Silas walked up onto the porch. He was covered in dust, his canvas coat smelling of horses, hay, and the sharp, clean scent of the pine forests. He took off his hat, revealing eyes that were no longer guarded and stormy, but warm and profoundly at peace. He didn't say a word. He stepped up behind her, wrapping his strong, calloused arms around her waist, and pulled her back flush against his broad chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her skin. "What are the numbers telling you today, Boston?" Silas murmured, his low voice vibrating against her back. Victoria leaned into his embrace, covering his scarred hands with her own. "They are telling me that the Vance Ranch is officially the most profitable cattle operation in the territory. We are entirely in the black." "Is that right?" Silas asked, a smile evident in his voice. He turned her slowly around in his arms, plucking the ledger from her hands and setting it gently on the porch railing. "I don't care about the black ink. I only care about the woman holding the pen." Victoria looked up at the rugged, handsome face of the man she had bought through a mail-order catalog. She thought of the men in Boston, the politicians in their tailored suits, the bankers with their smooth, empty promises, the gentleman who would have sold her soul for a shipping contract. She reached up, running her fingers through Silas's dark hair. She knew the truth now. True gentlemen didn't wear silk ties or operate in boardrooms. True gentlemen had dirt under their fingernails, calluses on their palms, and the unyielding courage to stand between the woman they loved and the fire. "I received a letter from my father's attorney yesterday," Victoria said softly, her eyes dancing with amusement. "They are still trying to locate me. They believe I was kidnapped by outlaws." Silas raised an eyebrow, his hands resting on the curve of her hips. "And what are you going to tell them?" "Nothing," Victoria replied, rising onto her tiptoes. "Let them search." Victoria Sterling died in a puddle of mud at the Red Creek train station, and Victoria Vance is exactly where she belongs. Silas's eyes darkened with a surge of overwhelming, consuming love. "You're damn right she is," he whispered fiercely. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of the home they had built together, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind them, sealing out the harsh frontier and leaving only the warmth of a perfectly balanced life. Nothing was what she had expected. It was infinitely better. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.